Utah Valley, with its wide mountains and quiet neighborhoods, is the kind of place where tragedy doesn't seem to belong. It's a place that often looks like the cover of a postcard. Snow-tipped peaks, rising above neat houses, families gathering in the warm glow of suburban living, children playing in safe cul-de-sacs. Among those families was the McNeil family, and to neighbors, they seemed like a picture of success. Martin and Michelle had been married for decades, raising a large family of mostly daughters. They appeared to have everything: money, a respected name, a house that reflected ambition and comfort. But beneath that facade, the cracks were already forming, and in 2007, those cracks would become deadly. Michelle McNeil was the kind of woman who seemed to radiate warmth. She was elegant but approachable, always neatly dressed, always attentive to her children. She was deeply religious, devoted to her family, and loved the role of being the heart of the home. Those who knew her described her as gentle, but also strong, a woman who gave her all to motherhood and found pride in raising her children with love and discipline. Michelle had 8 children, 4 biological and 4 adopted, and she poured herself into being a mother. To outsiders, she was what people in her community admired: a good woman, a good wife, someone who made her home beautiful and her family proud. Her husband, Martin McNeil, cut a different figure: a doctor, tall, intelligent, and commanding. Martin had built a reputation as a man who had worked hard to provide his family with success. He was a physician with influence in Utah, someone who presented himself as capable and authoritative. To many, he seemed charismatic, the kind of man who could control a room with his voice. But to those who lived under his roof, that charisma was sharper, more controlling, and often frightening. The McNeil children would later describe their father as someone who could be warm in public but cold and manipulative behind closed doors. He was demanding, secretive, and often unkind. Still, for Michelle, marriage was a promise, and she stayed, keeping the family together, raising the children, and building what looked from the outside like a strong life. By 2007, Michelle was in her early 50s, still beautiful, still graceful, but she carried the quiet insecurities that many women do after decades of marriage and motherhood. Martin, always concerned with appearances, had pressured her to undergo a cosmetic facelift. It wasn't just about beauty, it was about control. Michelle didn't want the surgery. She was nervous about it, aware of the risks, but Martin insisted. He pushed the idea until she gave in, wanting to keep the peace, wanting to make him happy, even though the thought unsettled her. For Michelle, the decision felt more like submission than choice. April 3rd, 2007, began like so many other days in the McNeil household, but it would end in tragedy. Michelle had just returned home from her cosmetic surgery, bandages wrapped carefully around her face, her body weakened from the procedures. The house was quieter than usual, her children bustling in and out, Martin at her side, at least for appearances. Michelle's daughter Alexis, studying in medical school at the time, was deeply concerned. She had watched her mother's recovery carefully, checked on her vitals, monitored her medications. Alexis had learned enough in her training to know that her mother's prescriptions, given to her by her father, seemed dangerously high. Michelle confided in her daughter, saying she felt strange, weak, not herself. She trusted Alexis, but she also wanted to trust Martin, the man she had leaned on for decades, the man who insisted he knew what was best for her. Alexis would later say she felt uneasy leaving the house that day, uneasy about her mother's condition. Michelle had looked pale, her energy fading, and her words had carried the tone of someone who was scared. But Alexis left, trying to balance her responsibilities as a student with her worries as a daughter, promising herself she would check in as soon as possible. The hours that followed carried a heaviness that no one in the McNeil family could ever forget. Around noon, Martin called 911 in a panic. His voice, strained but measured, told dispatchers that he had found his wife unresponsive in the bathtub. He said he had come into the bathroom and discovered her slumped in the water, lifeless. His words painted a picture of urgency. He needed help. He needed paramedics. But as the recording later revealed, there was something about his tone that didn't quite ring true. There was no raw shock, no genuine fear, just a rehearsed urgency, as if the lines had been spoken before. Paramedics rushed to the McNeil home. Michelle was pulled from the water, but her body was limp, her face pale, her chest still. The team worked frantically, performing CPR, pushing air into her lungs, trying to restart the rhythm of her heart. Martin stood nearby, not weeping, not collapsing, but watching, his expression unreadable. The children who were home, young and terrified, clung to each other as chaos filled the house. Despite the efforts of paramedics, Michelle was pronounced dead. The shock rippled instantly. A healthy woman in her 50s, gone so suddenly, just days after a surgery her husband had insisted upon. To neighbors, it was tragic. To the McNeil children, it was confusing and terrifying. And to Alexis, when she returned and heard the news, it was devastating, but also suspicious. She couldn't shake the unease she'd felt about the medication, about the strange lethargy in her mother's body, about her father's insistence that he knew best. Something wasn't right. At first, authorities treated Michelle's death as a tragedy connected to surgery complications. It wasn't unheard of. Sometimes anesthesia, pain medications, and the fragility of recovery combined in dangerous ways. The autopsy listed cardiovascular disease and the after effects of surgery as contributing factors. For most families, that would have been the end of it, a heartbreaking but natural explanation. But the McNeil children, led by Alexis, refused to accept it. They knew Michelle. They knew her strength, her health, her love of life, and they knew their father. Martin's behavior after Michelle's death only deepened their suspicion. Just weeks later, he brought a new woman into the house, Gypsy Willis, a woman much younger than him, whom he introduced as a nanny. To the children, it felt like a slap in the face, an insult to their mother's memory. Gypsy wasn't just a nanny, she was Martin's mistress, someone he had been seeing behind Michelle's back. The timing was cruel, almost taunting, and the children's grief mixed with anger. Alexis, in particular, became determined. She began digging, asking questions, writing down details, keeping track of her father's movements. Her siblings, though younger, rallied behind her. They remembered Michelle's warnings, the way she had confided in them that Martin was pressuring her, that she was uneasy about his controlling ways. They remembered her voice, soft but worried, telling them that if anything ever happened to her, they should look closer at their father. And now, faced with her sudden death, those words burned like a prophecy. The community at first didn't want to believe it. Martin McNeil was a doctor, a respected man, a husband who had just lost his wife. People offered condolences, brought meals, prayed for his family, but slowly, stories leaked. Whispers about the nanny, about Martin's coldness, about the children's growing insistence that their mother hadn't died naturally. It was no longer just a tragedy, it was a mystery. For Michelle's children, Grief became a mission. They would not let their mother's memory be reduced to a line in an autopsy report. They would not let their father's facade of respectability cover the darkness they believed lurked beneath. And as they began to piece together the truth, they uncovered a story more chilling than they could have imagined. A story of manipulation, betrayal, and murder hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect life. But in April 2007, all they had was suspicion, grief, and the uneasy feeling that their father had killed their mother. The truth would take years to prove, and the journey would test their strength, their unity, and their ability to confront the man who had raised them. And so, the stage was set. Michelle McNeil was gone, her children grieving, her husband distant and strange. The house in Utah, once full of warmth and laughter, was now haunted by questions. And the answers, when they finally came, would reveal how dangerous appearances can be, and how the people closest to us can sometimes hide the darkest secrets of all. The weeks after Michelle's death were supposed to be a time of mourning, a time for the McNeil family to come together, lean on each other, and heal. But instead, the house that had once been Michelle's sanctuary became something unrecognizable. Martin wasted little time before altering the family's reality, making decisions that stunned his children and outsiders alike. Barely a month after Michelle's funeral, Martin introduced someone new into the home. Her name was Gypsy Willis, a woman in her 30s with striking features, a sharp mind, and an unsettling presence. To the younger children, Martin explained that Gypsy was a nanny, someone brought in to help with household tasks and care. But to the older children, especially Alexis, it was immediately clear what she really was: Martin's lover. The timing was grotesque. Their mother's perfume still lingered faintly in the house. Her belongings hadn't even been cleared from the closets, and yet here was a stranger moving in, smiling faintly, too comfortable in a space that wasn't hers. The children were horrified. They had grown up under their father's imposing shadow, but this was something different. It wasn't just about control anymore. It was about betrayal made visible. They had barely begun to process the loss of their mother, and now they were expected to accept her replacement. Alexis, who had always been fiercely protective of Michelle, was enraged. She confronted her father, questioning his judgment, accusing him of disrespect, but Martin brushed her off. He was the patriarch, the decision-maker. His tone made it clear that resistance wouldn't change anything. Gypsy settled into the McNeil home with unsettling ease. She cooked meals, helped with the younger children, and more importantly, stayed close to Martin. Theirs wasn't a secret anymore. It was a bold flaunting of what had likely been going on long before Michelle's death. The children saw it, neighbors whispered about it, and Alexis began to connect the dots. Had this woman been the reason her father pushed Michelle into surgery? Was her mother's death the price for his freedom to live openly with his mistress? The thought sickened her, but she couldn't shake it. Martin's behavior continued to raise red flags. He was emotionally distant, almost cold, as though Michelle's death had barely touched him. Instead of reminiscing about her or showing sorrow, he seemed focused on his new relationship and his own self-image. To friends and colleagues, he put on a mask of grief, but to his children, the mask kept slipping. They saw his temper flare, his arrogance resurface, and his growing obsession with Gypsy. The man who had once prided himself on family and community no longer seemed interested in either. The older children began to talk among themselves in whispers, away from their father's earshot. They remembered Michelle's warnings, how she had confided in them that she felt uneasy about Martin. Some recalled her saying that if anything happened to her, they should question their father. It had seemed paranoid at the time, but now it felt chillingly prophetic. The younger children, confused and grieving, clung to their older siblings for guidance. Alexis, in particular, became the anchor. She refused to let her mother's death be dismissed as a tragic accident. Her medical training gave her insight that others overlooked. She reviewed Michelle's autopsy and prescriptions, noticing the cocktail of drugs her father had provided after surgery: Valium, Ambien, Lortab, Percocet. The dosages were unusually high, even reckless. Michelle had complained of feeling strange, disoriented, and it suddenly made sense. Martin had been over-medicating her. Alexis believed it wasn't negligence, it was deliberate. But proving that was another matter entirely. Martin was respected. He was a physician, a man of authority. The medical examiner's report leaned toward natural causes, noting cardiovascular disease as a factor. Without new evidence, Alexis's suspicions sounded like grief-stricken paranoia to outsiders, but she knew better. Meanwhile, Martin's relationship with Gypsy grew bolder. The two were seen in public together, dining, shopping, living as if they were already a couple free of consequence. To his children, Martin's facade of a grieving widower crumbled completely. They began to despise him, not just for his betrayal of Michelle, but for the looming fear that he had orchestrated her death. The McNeil daughters took matters into their own hands. They began keeping notes, collecting details about Gypsy, digging into her past. What they uncovered only deepened the unease. Gypsy wasn't just a random woman. She had a history, financial troubles, a background that didn't fit the role of a harmless nanny. She was manipulative, ambitious, and perfectly aligned with Martin's darker side. Their suspicions eventually reached authorities, but at first, law enforcement hesitated. Without a clear smoking gun, what could they do? But the persistence of Michelle's children, especially Alexis, kept the case from fading into silence. They went to prosecutors, investigators, anyone who would listen, repeating their mother's story, their father's odd behavior, and the eerie arrival of Gypsy. Over time, investigators began to see the pattern: Michelle's sudden death, Martin's insistence on the facelift, the dangerous prescriptions, the rushed romance with Gypsy. It all formed a narrative that was too compelling to ignore. But still, evidence was thin. They needed something concrete, something undeniable. In the meantime, Martin's behavior spiraled. His arrogance grew, his control over the family became more suffocating, and his relationship with Gypsy became reckless. He used his position to manipulate situations, to silence doubts, to continue living as though nothing had happened. But the children's persistence had cracked the surface. Rumors spread. The community began to question him, and eventually, so did the law. By 2008, investigators had officially reopened the case into Michelle's death. The cause of death was re-examined. Toxicology reports were scrutinized, and experts were brought in to review the medications prescribed. Slowly, a clearer picture began to form. Michelle hadn't simply drowned in the bathtub. She had been incapacitated, drugged to the point of unconsciousness, and left vulnerable. Her death wasn't an accident. It was homicide. The children's voices had finally been heard. Michelle's warnings, from beyond the grave, passed down through her daughters, had forced the truth into the light. And now, Martin was no longer just a grieving husband in the public's eye. He was a suspect. But bringing him to justice wouldn't be easy. Martin was clever, manipulative, and he had years of experience covering his tracks. Investigators needed to build a case strong enough to withstand his defense, and that meant digging deeper into his life, his finances, and his relationship with Gypsy. What they found was a web of lies and deceit, more tangled than anyone had imagined. Martin had lived a life full of secrets, affairs, fraud, manipulations, all hidden behind the mask of a respectable doctor. His children, once under his control, were now his greatest threat. And as the case built against him, the world would see not the portrait of a family man, but the reality of a narcissist willing to sacrifice anyone, even his wife, for his own desires. The path to justice was still long. Years would pass before a courtroom heard the truth. But the cracks in Martin's armor had spread, and for Michelle's children, who had lost their mother and watched their father betray her memory, there was no turning back. They would fight relentlessly until the man they once called Dad was forced to face what he had done. As the years passed after Michelle's death, the McNeil children never stopped speaking her name. They held on to memories of her laugh, her gentle advice, the way she cared for them, as though each child was her only one. But grief had fused into determination. Their father's facade was cracking, and they were going to make sure the world saw what they saw. Investigators finally began to uncover the layers Martin had worked so hard to hide. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Martin wasn't just a grieving widower who had moved on too quickly. He was a man with a history of deceit, affairs hidden over the years, fraudulent activities, and a narcissism that seeped into every part of his life. The man who had once been respected in his community was revealed to be a liar and a manipulator, and at the center of it all was Michelle, the woman who had given him her life and who, in return, had been taken away in the most brutal way possible. The investigation dug deeper into Gypsy Willis. She wasn't just a random lover. She was a central figure in Martin's plans. Detectives discovered that Martin and Gypsy had gone beyond romance. They had been plotting a new life together. They had even gone as far as to conspire in identity theft, stealing the name of one of Michelle and Martin's adopted daughters to create a new persona for Gypsy. It was brazen and sloppy, and it provided investigators with something concrete, evidence of a conspiracy, a willingness to break laws to be together. It was motive, it was opportunity, and it tied back to Michelle's death. The re-examination of Michelle's autopsy brought the most chilling revelations. Experts agreed that the combination of drugs in her system, powerful painkillers, sedatives, and anti-anxiety medications, were far too dangerous, especially given her fragile state after surgery. It wasn't just medical negligence, it was a deliberate act. Michelle had been incapacitated, drugged into helplessness. When her body was found in the bathtub, the water wasn't the killer. It was the medications her husband had given her. She had been silenced, erased, so Martin could move on with Gypsy without the burden of a wife. By 2012, nearly 5 years after Michelle's death, prosecutors were ready. Martin McNeil was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. For his children, the news was both a relief and a heartbreak. They had fought tirelessly to be heard, to make people see the truth, and now justice was finally within reach. But it also meant reliving every detail of their mother's final days, sitting in a courtroom across from the man who had raised them, and listening to his defense try to erase their mother's story once again. The trial became one of Utah's most watched cases. The courtroom was packed, reporters lined the halls, and the McNeil children sat in the gallery, a united front for their mother. Alexis testified, her voice steady but filled with emotion, recounting the conversation she had with Michelle before her death. She spoke about the medications, the way her mother had felt drugged and weak, and the unease that had haunted her since that day. Other daughters added their voices, painting a portrait of Michelle as a loving, devoted woman, and Martin as cold, controlling, and obsessed with appearances. The defense tried to spin a different story. They argued that Michelle's death had been a tragic accident, the unfortunate result of surgery complications. They suggested that the medications weren't unusual, that drowning was plausible, that Martin was being unfairly demonized by grief-stricken children. But the evidence told a different story. The drug levels, the timing, the presence of Gypsy, it all pointed to one conclusion. As the trial stretched on, the McNeil children endured moments of anguish. Watching their father sit at the defense table, emotionless, occasionally smirking, was unbearable. This was the man who had once tucked them into bed, who had told them he loved them, now fighting to escape accountability for the most unforgivable act. But they stayed strong, holding on to each other, holding on to Michelle. In November 2013, the jury delivered its verdict. Martin McNeil was guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of sobs, gasps, and relief. For the McNeil children, it was vindication. Their mother's death had not been in vain. Their voices had been heard. The man who had stolen Michelle from them was finally being held accountable. The sentencing brought its own wave of emotion. Martin McNeil, once a respected doctor, once a husband and father, was sentenced to life in prison. He would never again walk freely, never again manipulate the world with his charm. For Michelle's children, it was a moment of justice, though not closure. Nothing could bring their mother back, but at least the truth had been acknowledged, and the lie their father had tried to live was shattered forever. Yet the story didn't end in the courtroom. In 2017, while serving his sentence, Martin McNeil was found dead in prison, an apparent suicide. For some of the children, it brought a sense of finality. For others, it reopened wounds. He had escaped accountability in life so many times, and in the end, he had found his own escape in death. But one truth remained. Michelle's voice, though silenced in 2007, had carried through her children. They had fought for her, and they had won. The McNeil case is remembered not only for the crime itself, but for the incredible strength of Michelle's children. They had been forced to grow up in the shadow of a man who controlled them, manipulated them, and ultimately betrayed them in the worst way possible. And yet they found the courage to fight back, to demand justice, and to ensure that their mother's story was told. The image of Michelle, smiling, graceful, and kind, remains at the heart of the case. She was more than a victim. She was a mother, a wife, a woman who deserved to grow old and watch her children flourish. Her life was stolen, but her children made sure her memory wasn't. The story of Martin and Michelle McNeil is a chilling reminder of how appearances can deceive, how respectability can mask evil, and how love can be twisted into control. But it's also a story of resilience, of children who refused to be silenced, who turned their grief into a weapon, and who made sure their mother's truth lived on. And that's what makes this case unforgettable. If you found this story as haunting and powerful as I did, make sure to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe